The first man to laugh was Boone Parish, loud, clear across the glade, hands on his hips and beard bristling with spit and chew. He'd spat tobacco into the snow and pointed with a leather glove like he'd spotted a lunatic down the slope. "You see that?" he'd hollered to the others. "Old Langston's building himself a tomb." They all turned. 6 men, sweat-caked from sawing pine, stopped to gawk, and sure enough, down the ravine, crouched like a marmot in the dirt, was Ethan Langston, digging. Not a post hole, not a cellar, not any sort of cabin foundation, just a wide, sloping ramp of dirt and snow into the hillside itself. Late autumn winds whipped around his shoulders, and he wasn't bracing a structure. No roof, no beams, just a trench, the way a man might dig to hide something, or bury something. "Don't tell me that's your firewood shed," Boone bellowed across the trees, laughing. "You planning to stack it with bones instead of logs?" Langston didn't answer. He'd learned by then not to. The last 3 winters had taught him a quiet man outlives a loud fool, and that most men in these mountains feared embarrassment more than starvation. So he kept digging, and the hollow earth swallowed the sound of their ridicule. He'd started weeks earlier, when the other men were still drying out their logs in morning sun or leaning them against makeshift fence rails. Every other homestead in the canyon, from Hemple Creek to Bonner Ridge, kept their firewood out in the open. Even covered wood was wood exposed, wrapped in hides or tarred with pitch. Some used old wagon tops. One man just left his pile under a leaning pine. They mocked Langston because his idea was something different, and in the mountains, different was what got men accused of madness. But Langston wasn't mad. He was remembering. 3 winters back, his wife got pneumonia. Not because the cold had been so brutal, that part was expected. It was because the thaw came early. A week of rains in February. Every man's stacked cords turned to pulp, even the ones tarped and lashed. Langston's roof had leaked. His logs had rotted. They'd frozen together like sponge cakes soaked in molasses, black on the inside, crumbling in the stove. For 4 days, he'd fed brush to the fire like a desperate animal. By the time he got into town to trade for real lumber, she was coughing up blood. She didn't last till March. So now, with the earth still unfrozen, he was digging. Not for a cellar, not for a cache, for something better, a buried room, not just beneath his cabin, beside it. A space carved into the slope, 2 feet down, walled with stacked stone, roofed with thick planks overlaid by earth. A shelter for wood, not just from the snow, but from the rain, the thaw, the rot that came with early sun. He didn't care if it looked like a grave. It was a promise, a dry place. They wouldn't understand, not Boone Parish, not Tom Cord, not even gentle-faced Warren Mears. They all thought winter only meant the cold. Langston knew better. Winter was treachery. It changed shape halfway through. First it bit, then it lied. And the ones who laughed in November were often crying by February. Still, the mocking never stopped. "They'll find him frozen down there like a root cellar carrot," someone said at the Slope Saloon one night. "He ain't stacking wood, he's burying secrets," another laughed. Langston didn't drink with them. He came into town for oats and salt and wagon nails, and he left before the dark. Every time he passed them on the main road or in the timber lines, their faces curled with something between mirth and pity. They couldn't figure if he was crazy or just broken. Most figured both. But in the evenings, back on his land, Langston built like a man who didn't need permission. The trench became a room. The room took walls. Thick logs formed retaining beams, fitted tight like ship. Planks. The roof was 6 inches of planking and 3 feet of earth above that. It looked like nothing from the outside. A mound, a slope, a path vanishing into a half-buried door, but inside, it stayed dry, still, and dark. No wind, no wet, no noise. A perfect room for fire to sleep through the months ahead. By December, the snow began. The other men stacked their wood high and under hides. Langston watched from his cabin door, satisfied. His wood, 3 full cords, was dry beneath his boots. His own wife, long gone, stared down from the mantel with the ghost of a knowing smile in her portrait. The cabin walls creaked, the wind howled. Winter had arrived, and at first, the other men laughed even harder. Boone made a point to haul his own logs past Langston's trailhead, just close enough for Langston to hear the whooping. He'd tied them with bright yellow rope like a parade. "You sure you don't want some real wood?" Boone shouted. "We got enough to spare for—" "Your mole hole!" Langston didn't answer. He was watching the sky. It was colder than usual. That meant the thaw would come early. The mountains always took with one hand what they gave with the other. January passed. The snow deepened. Wolves cried at night. Somewhere on the ridge, a cabin burned down. No one knew whose. But the wind carried smoke for 2 days. Then came the thaw. not the gentle drip of a slow melt. No, this was a break, a lurch, a cracking, in the spine of winter itself. The snow turned to sludge in a single day. The air thickened with rot. Frozen creeks became torrents. Logs rolled in the current. Roofs shed sheets of wet snow like sloughing skin. And the firewood, the precious stacks every man had built, began to drown. Langston didn't go outside that morning. He was already underground, pulling logs from his buried room with bare hands and a grin on his face. The wood was dry, the bark still sharp. No mold, no mush, no smell but that of cedar and cold dust. It burned clean in his stove. It cracked like summer trees. He stepped out onto his porch around midday, just to breathe. The road below him was a swamp of brown slush and warped bark. Chunks of firewood floated down past the fence posts. A child's sled bobbed in the current. The sky wept like something ashamed. And from the tree line, half a mile off, came a distant voice. Boone Parish, soaked to the waist, dragging a sled with what looked like a tarped mess of ruined wood. His eyes caught Langston's. He didn't speak, didn't wave, just stared. Langston didn't grin, he didn't gloat, but he did call down. "You still got enough to spare?" Boone didn't answer. He trudged on, boots sinking with each step, his firewood crumbling behind him like old bread. Langston didn't leave his porch for the rest of that day. He didn't need to. The mountain told him everything he needed to know. Streams gushed where trails used to be. The sky drooped, swollen with grey, and the snow, what was left of it, had a crust like bread gone sour. Even the air smelled wrong. Wet wood, mold, pine rot. The smell of hope drowned before it could kindle. The next man to appear was Warren Mears, just past dusk, alone. Langston heard the knock before he saw the shape in the dark. 3 raps, not a man begging, but one asking. A proud knock, but slower than usual. He opened the door with one hand on his stove poker. It wasn't that he didn't trust Warren. It was that any man walking in this slush past sunset wasn't himself. He wasn't armed, just soaked, shoulders hunched, beard dripping, hat caved in from meltwater, and in his hands, a bushel basket of what had once been firewood, now blackened on the edges, clumped with mud, and reeking of fermentation. Warren didn't speak right away. He just looked at Langston's boots, then at the stove behind him, then at the warm orange glow that licked the cabin walls. Langston didn't smile. He didn't have to. "Can I dry off?" Warren asked, voice quiet. Langston stepped aside, said nothing. The cabin was warm, not hot like some bragging fire, but steady, dry, the kind of heat that lasted, that didn't hiss or puff or claw. It just breathed. Warren sat by the fire and pulled off his gloves with effort. They squelched. He didn't try to set the basket down. He already knew it wouldn't dry. It was ruined wood. He left it by the door like a corpse too wet to bury. "Boone lost half his stack," Warren muttered after a while. "Cord's worse off. Had his logs piled under that ledge near Rushing Creek. Water came straight through." Langston didn't answer. He stirred the stove and fed it one clean log from the pile beside his chair. The sound it made as it caught, like bones clicking in warmth, was louder than any reply. "You were right," Warren said finally. Langston turned to look at him. The man's hands were trembling, not from cold, but from knowing, from swallowing pride that had been frozen all season and was now melting faster than his roof. "I wasn't trying to be right," Langston said, low. "I was trying not to bury another winter's worth of regrets." Warren nodded, looked down at his boots. They talked little, the way mountain men did, with long silences full of memory, not awkwardness. After half an hour, Warren stood, thanked him without words, and left his basket of rot by the door. Langston didn't stop him. It'd go to kindling at best. That night he watched the wind shift directions and knew the freeze was coming back. The melt was always quick, but the cold came after, like a punishment. He braced the cabin's outer door, shoveled around the firewood room's entry so the runoff wouldn't pool and freeze, and brought in 3 more logs. The storm that hit next wasn't snow. It was glass. Everything froze in place. Icicles formed on moving water. Wind whistled like it was cutting strings. Langston woke to see entire trees snapped mid-trunk, their exposed cores glittering with ice like candles gone hard. He didn't leave the cabin for 2 days. Others weren't so lucky. By the 3rd day, the bodies came. Not dead men yet, but broken ones. Men who'd run out of dry wood and were too proud to ask their neighbors. Boone Parish among them. Langston saw him stumbling down the slope at sunrise, dragging a sled not of wood, but of bones. Antlers, branches, brush, anything that could burn or might. His beard was full of ice, his hands wrapped in spare saddle leather. He didn't knock. Langston met him outside, bundled in his winter coat, the wind howling behind them. Boone didn't speak first. The man was shivering, mouth tight like he'd been chewing on a nail all morning. "I can pay," he said at last. "Got tools, traps, even a mule if it comes to that." Langston narrowed his eyes, not with judgment, with caution. "You stacked 7 cords in November," he said. Slowly. Bragged they'd last till April. Boone nodded, shame flooding every movement like sap gone thick. Them logs turn to wet bread, he said, almost laughing. Damn snow never had the decency to stay frozen. Langston pointed with his chin toward the buried room. Take what you need. Bring back double come spring. Boone didn't thank him, not with words, just with a look. A man might hate another his whole life, but still owe him warmth. That kind of debt sat deep. By midweek, Langston's Firewood room had served 5 men. Some came quiet, others loud and ashamed. All left warmer than they arrived. The dry logs, protected for months beneath the earth, burned like kindling kissed by summer. The room had stayed dry, insulated by stone and sod, sealed tight from wind and flood. The men who had mocked it now visited it like a chapel, but not all were content with charity. Word spread, and with it, greed. Late one night, long after the last of the thaw had frozen over again, Langston heard the sound of steel on wood, not the gentle knock of a neighbor. No, this was a prybar. He stepped outside with his rifle, bare-chested beneath his coat, frost biting his skin, and caught 2 shadows hunched over the buried room's door. They weren't men he knew, drifters maybe, or neighbors pushed too far. Didn't matter. Langston cocked the lever of his Winchester, and the sound rang through the trees like a slap. The figures froze. "Drop it," he said. They did. Both men raised their hands, faces pale in moonlight. One of them looked barely 20, the other older, with frostbit fingers poking from threadbare gloves. "Didn't know it was yours," the older one said. Langston shook his head. "You came with tools." A pause. The younger one muttered, "We were cold." Langston didn't lower the rifle. "So was my wife," he said. 3 years back, cold and dying while I burned brush and prayed." The wind screamed. "You want wood, you ask," Langston said. "You steal, I bury you beside it." Neither man moved. Langston finally lowered the rifle, then kicked the prybar toward them. "Use it to dig your own room. Before next winter." They scrambled off like dogs, boots skidding in ice, the woods swallowing them whole. Langston stood in silence after they were gone, watching his breath coil like smoke into the black. By spring, his Firewood room was half empty, but his cabin was full of life. The stove still burned, the logs were still dry, and neighbors who'd never tipped their hat before now came bearing jerky, tools, sacks of flour. Men who had once laughed at the mole hole now asked if he'd show them how to dig one. Some built their own. One man tried to hire Langston outright. He refused, quietly, without cruelty. "It ain't the digging," he said. "It's the remembering. You don't build something like that unless you've been cold, the kind that scars your soul." But he gave advice. He showed where to dig to avoid runoff, what wood to line the walls with, how to seal the door with sod and dry moss. And by the next winter, there were 3 more buried rooms along the ridge. Boone built his deeper. Warren added a vent pipe for smoke. Cord used stone from an old well, and every one of them stacked their firewood like it was treasure, because now they understood. Now they'd seen what Langston had seen, that the mountain wasn't cruel, just honest, and if you didn't listen, it'd teach you with frostbite and flood. Langston never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. He just kept digging. By midsummer, he'd started expanding the room, not for more firewood, for food storage. The ice melt had ruined more than just logs that year. Root cellars had flooded, meat stores spoiled, so he carved deeper, built new shelves, added drainage, a new door braced in iron. And when the fall came again, the men didn't laugh. They watched, they took notes. Some followed, others still mocked, but only behind closed doors, and never above a whisper, because now they knew the mountain didn't reward pride. It rewarded those willing to dig. It wasn't until the following September that Langston noticed just how many eyes now watched the slope he called home. Not just passing glances from town men riding the ridge trails, but lingered stares, long ones, from strangers, from settlers, new to the territory who'd heard, from mouths they trusted, that there was a man up the mountain who'd never run out of dry wood. That was the thing about these hills. Nothing stayed secret once it worked. Not heat, not food, not fire, and not survival. Whispers moved faster than river ice. By the time Langston's buried Firewood room had gone an entire winter without a single log gone soft or moldy, it was legend. And legends, real ones, were rarer than gold. At first it was just the neighbors who'd once laughed. Boone, Cord, Warren, the same men who'd heckled now offered strange little tokens. A fine handsaw left on his porch, a wheelbarrow wheel freshly greased, a small sack of apples, not even half rotten. Nobody said thanks directly. That wasn't the way of these mountains. But they came, and they gave, and they watched. and Langston understood. But then others came, men he didn't know, families even, settlers too new to have a barn, some with children trailing behind them like shadows, and more often than not they asked the same thing. Could you show us how to make one? Langston would look them over, not judge, just weigh. He could see in a man's boots how much he feared winter, could read in the way a woman held her shawl whether she'd been cold before. The desperate ones, he helped. He showed them the slope, the angle of the drainage, how deep to dig before stone turned to ice. He showed them where to brace the beams and how to layer the floor with packed gravel so meltwater wouldn't seep in come spring. But for the ones who wanted quick tricks, who wanted shortcuts, who asked if they could just buy his plans and be done, he gave them a look so flat they usually backed away. This room wasn't built in a weekend, he'd say. It was built in a winter with no wood. You don't build something like this from a drawing. You build it from grief. Some didn't get it. Some left, muttering. But the right ones stayed. One of them was a widow named Clara Emmons, had a boy, maybe 9, who wore boots 3 sizes too big and kept a rifle slung over his back like he was 12. She didn't beg, and she didn't flatter. She just came one morning with a team of mules and said, "I got a dry hillside and no man to dig it. I'll work if you'll show me how." Langston didn't answer right away. He studied the boy, saw the way his fingers wrapped around the rifle's neck too hard, the way his mother's eyes darted between tree lines even when she smiled. He nodded, and for the next month, they dug. Langston didn't speak much, and neither did she, but she followed every word he gave with the obedience of someone who'd watched a house catch fire in snow. She brought logs already split, laid them out to dry, watched the winds. She built her buried room not beside the house, but beneath it, down a sloped tunnel from the back wall. It was the best design he'd ever seen a woman build. Before the first frost, she came to his door with a jar of bear fat and a woven scarf. "No man taught me how to trap," she said. "I figured it out when my husband froze 2 years back. This is from that." Langston took it, didn't speak, didn't need to. The boy, silent behind her, tipped his too large hat. That winter came fast. No melt, just cold. Weeks of it. The sky stayed pale, like a lid pressed over the valley. Trees groaned. Men went mad from quiet. Fires burned day and night. It was the kind of season that exposed every lie a man told himself about. Being ready. Langston didn't run out of wood, neither did Clara, but Boone did. Even with the new buried room he'd built, too shallow, rushed. It flooded early in the freeze when a spring he hadn't found seeped up through the back wall. His logs went soft again. Not mush, but sponge. They hissed and steamed. He came to Langston with frostbite on his fingers, shoulders shaking, no pride left in his eyes. Langston gave him wood, gave him a dry blanket too. "Dig higher next time," was all he said. Boone nodded. He was no longer a loud man. The mountain had quieted him. It had a way of doing that. By January, half the men on the southern ridge had tried to build underground. Some succeeded, others failed. A few blamed Langston for their failures, muttering in town that he must have held back secrets. But anyone who saw his hands knew that wasn't true. They were the hands of a digger, split, blackened in places, skin calloused into a second hide, the kind of hands that didn't get built from words, but from months under frozen earth. It was Warren Mears who finally said what most had been thinking. "You started something you didn't mean to," he told Langston over a kettle fire one night. "These men think your buried room is a trick. A cheat, like you conjured fire from the ground instead of digging for it." Langston didn't answer at first. He stirred the stew, let the smoke rise. "I built a grave," he said at last, "and filled it with fire. What they're trying to copy is the fire, not the grave." Warren blinked, said nothing, just nodded, because he understood. That room, that dirt-walled box, was more than a shelter. It was a memory of a woman who died cold, of nights spent burning brush and praying for wind to shift, of mornings where the frost clung to the rafters like a warning. That was the real reason Langston's fire stayed dry. Not just the stone, not just the logs, but the loss behind it all. By March, the melt began. Again, not as sudden as before, more patient, like the mountain too had learned a lesson. Langston watched from his porch as the world dripped. This time, there was no panic. He saw Boone hauling firewood with care, pulling logs only as needed from his rebuilt room. He saw Clara's boy practicing rifle shots into stumps, calm, warm, not a shiver on him. He saw Warren trading dried meats in town, telling men how deep they needed to go, how to brace a beam, how to smell rot before it showed. The mountain was quieter now, less foolish, and in the stillness, Langston dug again, not for firewood, not for food, but for spring water. He'd found a vein beneath his cabin, slow, clear, steady. He'd tasted it, cold as snowmelt, but sweet. It gave him an idea, a buried cistern, a water room, not just to keep from freezing, but to store water against drought. Neighbors called him mad again, but quieter now, with less laughter, because they remembered how the last time ended. This time, Boone asked to help. Langston let him. Boone never complained about the digging, not once. He was slower now, his back stiffer, but he worked like a man ashamed of how long it had taken him to believe. "You ever think," Boone muttered one day, "that maybe you're the one shaping this mountain, like you're digging your way into changing how it works?" Langston smiled faintly. "No," he said, "I'm just finally listening to it, because that was the truth. The mountain didn't change. The men did, and all Langston had ever done was stop pretending he could tame it. He'd buried his firewood not because he wanted to beat the snow, but because he knew the snow would never play fair. The others were learning, slowly, one grave, one room, one winter at a time. Spring always came slow to that stretch of the southern ridge. When the town thawed and fields below turned to wet green, Langston's slope still bore old snow. That year, it lingered longer than usual. Foot thick by mid-April, trees drooped with frost-laced limbs. The air was dry, too dry for that time of year. Not even the chickadees sang, just the creak of the forest and the low moan of shifting ice beneath the earth. Langston took it for what it was, a warning. A late spring meant a late melt. A late melt meant a surge, not like the slow thaw of shallow valleys. In the high woods, melt came all at once, weeks' worth of frozen water collapsing in days. Langston had seen it before. He knew what was coming. This time he didn't dig. He prepared. He checked the water runoffs around the buried room. He rebraced the slope near the back wall, cleared drainage down the slope with a pickaxe and spade, stacked stones into miniature levees where soft spots had emerged. Not flashy work, not the kind that made a man feel clever, but the kind that meant something when the skies let loose. Warren passed through just before the surge, still limping from frostbite, still wearing that same faded blue coat that hung off him like it belonged to someone who'd lived a better life. "Town says it's gonna flood," Warren said, squinting toward the ridge. "Tanner Creek's already spilling. Folks got wagons lashed to trees." Langston nodded. "Let it come." Warren raised an eyebrow. "You built a dam I don't see?" "No," Langston said, "but I built my mistakes last year. Learned from 'em. Let them flood. I'm high enough." Warren looked at the cabin, then at the slope where the buried firewood room sat beneath its mound of moss and stone. The sod was still frozen but held fast. Drainage ditches fanned out like sun rays from the entrance. Langston had shaped the slope not like a man defending against water, but like a man guiding it, a shepherd of snowmelt. He stayed 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, the world broke open. It started with a sound like thunder, though the skies were clear. Then a distant roaring, not wind, not animals, but water, thousands of tons of it, racing down from the peaks where the last of the ice had finally let go. Langston stood on his porch and watched the forest weep. Snowbanks melted from beneath. Trees moaned as frozen roots gave up the fight. Rivulets of brown water cascaded down every slope, filling creeks, then rivers, then dry beds that hadn't run in years. At Tanner Creek, cabins built too low were already losing porches. Langston's slope held. The buried room stayed dry. Boone, not so lucky, came up mid-morning with mud halfway up his chest. He was dragging a sled piled not with firewood, but with his daughter and the last dry sacks of flour from his cabin. "They're gone," he gasped when he reached Langston's porch. "Cord's whole stack. Gone. Water came through the cut behind the ridge, took the shed with it." Langston helped the girl down, wrapped her in a wool blanket and gave her honey water warmed on the stove. She didn't speak, just blinked slow, like a mad deer stunned from fear. Boone sat beside her, head in his hands, panting steam. "I thought we had it figured," he murmured. "Thought I'd learned." "You built where you were told," Langston said, "not where the land said." Boone nodded. "Too shallow again?" Langston shook his head. "Too low. The hill protects from snow, but not water if the runoff gets blocked. You needed height more than depth." Boone stared at the floor, didn't argue, didn't cry, just listened, and maybe, just maybe, began to understand the part no one talked about. These hills didn't just demand strength, they demanded humility. You had to kneel to them, to study their bends and grooves, to know where water wanted to go, and make sure your house wasn't there when it did. By midday, 2 more families arrived, then a third. 6 people crammed into Langston's cabin. One of them, Holt Wintry, a quiet farmer who rarely left his field, had frostbite so bad on both feet that he couldn't walk. Clara Emmons helped tend him. She showed up with her son and a satchel full of dried rabbit meat and willow bark tea. "We're fine up our slope," she told Langston. "Built it the way you said. Just came to help." Langston looked her over, noted the way her hands were steady even as the skies wept. "Good," he said. "Stay as long as you want." By nightfall, the cabin had turned into a refuge, a place for stories told in whispers, for wet coats hung near the stove, for quiet meals eaten in gratitude. The buried room, though intended for firewood, now served more than one purpose. Langston opened the door and let the air rush in. It was cold, dry, and empty enough to store what supplies hadn't spoiled in the rush. Sacks of potatoes, jerky, tools, even a cot for those who needed space away from the snoring. That night, Boone sat beside the fire and stared into the flames. "You're gonna have to build more of these," he said. Langston looked up. "These rooms," Boone continued, "you got folk coming from every ridge. It ain't just about firewood no more. These rooms, they're safety. They're answers." Langston shook his head. "I don't build answers," he said. "I build so I don't freeze." But Boone wouldn't let it go. "You say that, but you've made a place that don't just survive the winter. It survives the flood, the thaw, the hunger. You keep building. You might outlive all of us." Langston didn't smile. He rarely did, but the fire danced in his eyes as he stirred the embers. "I don't want to outlive anyone," he said. "I just don't want to bury another soul in the cold." The next week passed, like a dream wrapped in fog. Days of melt, then sudden freezes. Trees fell across trails. Horses drowned in mud pits where streams had swelled without warning. One man froze solid after his wagon axle broke near Rattler Hollow. They found him with his hand still clutching the reins. His logs had gone soft. Couldn't get a fire started in time. Langston never lost a log, even after opening the room to others. He rotated his stack with care. Only dry wood in, only dry wood out. Boone and Clara helped keep track. They were fast learners. By the time the thaw ended, they'd memorized every brace and angle of the slope. They started calling it the spine. Langston didn't like names, didn't see the point, but he let them have it. He had other work to do, because he'd noticed something. The earth was shifting, not just from the melt, but deeper. The rear wall of the buried room was weeping, just a trickle, a steady line of moisture along the base logs. At first he thought it was surface runoff. But the flow stayed even, never rising or falling. It was pressure from beneath. He cut a drain channel that night, used a pickaxe to strike into the bedrock on the downslope side. Took him hours. His hands bled. But when the final crack opened and water surged out, clean, sweet, steady, he understood. He'd hit a spring, not just runoff, real water, cold as snowmelt, but pure, a hidden river beneath his room, and with it, a new idea. If he could channel that water, slow it, guide it, not just drain it, he could build something better, a second chamber, this time not for fire, but for food, not a root cellar, something deeper, colder, safer, an earth refrigerator fed by spring water, a place to store meat through summer, a place no rat could reach, no sun could spoil. When he told Clara, she didn't laugh. She helped him measure. When he told Boone, the man asked how deep he'd need to dig. And when Warren came through the next week, limping and grumbling about spoiled pork and black mold, Langston pointed toward the slope and simply said, "Come see what cold can do when you use it." It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a shift. One grave at a time, the mountain was teaching its people how to survive, not by strength, but by surrender, by watching, by listening, by digging deep and trusting the earth to hold. Langston dug until his fingers bled again, and the others, they followed. By early summer, word had moved beyond the ridge, down into the valley towns, past the creeks that fed east into cattle country, and up the telegraph lines carried by travelers and postmen. It wasn't just that a man had kept his firewood dry through the worst freeze and melt the mountains had seen in a generation. It was the way he'd done it, without boards, without nails, without tricks or trade goods, just stone, earth, and memory. Some called it a dirt vault. Others whispered about Langston's room. A few said he'd found some kind of natural formation, like a cave or ancient shelter. But the ones who came to see it with their own eyes all left changed. That summer, more than 20 people visited Langston's homestead, not as guests, not as gossips, but as students. A few stayed and helped him dig the second chamber. Others took notes and walked off into the trees with shovels. One man rode a donkey 70 miles just to sketch the slope and left a silver coin as thanks before disappearing again. Langston didn't chase fame. He rarely even spoke unless someone asked a direct question. He just kept building. The second chamber took shape slower than the firewood room had. The spring beneath it required care. Too deep and the water flooded. Too shallow and it dried up. Langston and Clara spent hours testing clay sealants, carving flow troughs, and lining the inner walls with stacked slate to keep cold air from escaping. The air inside stayed cool as a spring house, colder even. Boone called it a winter that never ends. They stored smoked meats in it by August, and when Langston's roof cured enough to hang a cured elk leg, they were already planning the third chamber. "You're building a town under the hill," Warren joked one morning as he helped dig drainage rock. Langston grunted. "Not a town, a spine." Clara looked up from where she was sealing a vent with pine pitch. "He means a body," she said softly, "one that lives through winter, where each room is an organ, fire, food, water." Langston didn't correct her, because she was right. By September, The buried complex had become 3 full chambers, each connected by short tunnel corridors just tall enough to walk through stooped. There were no windows, no lanterns unless needed. The rooms stayed cold, still, perfect, earth pressed close on all sides. But the way Langston had built them, it didn't feel like a cave. It felt like protection. Men began building copies now, not close to Langston's land, but across the county. Some paid to have Clara or Boone consult. Others came in secret, watching the angles of Langston's slopes, the slope of the roof mounds, the layers of packed sod. The imitations varied in success. Some built too close to floodplains. Others didn't dig deep enough, or used rotten timber, or forgot to brace against collapse. One man near Sparrow Lake dug so poorly his food chamber caved in mid-autumn. He barely made it out. His daughter didn't. Langston rode out to the site that night after Warren delivered the news. Stood over the fallen roof, torchlight flickering against collapsed earth. He didn't speak, just walked the perimeter, then knelt beside the body wrapped in canvas. Warren stood beside him. "You could have made money, Ethan," Warren said. "Sold your knowledge, drawn up plans, made a name." Langston shook his head. "This was never about being clever or new. I built a place to keep from burying another loved one. But now they're burying each other, trying to copy it without understanding why." Warren lit his pipe. "So what do you do?" Langston stood. "Teach." That fall, he did something no one expected. He rode into town, to the schoolhouse, and asked if he could speak to anyone willing to learn. Not children, though they listened too, but homesteaders, men, women, the types who once laughed and now watched winter the way soldiers watched smoke. He drew diagrams on slate boards, brought sacks of dirt and chunks of stone, explained temperature gradients, airflow, drainage patterns. He showed them how water moved through clay, how frost buckled timbers, how stacked sod could hold heat better than a plank wall. Boone came with him. So did Clara. Warren too. They spoke of mistakes, of what they'd lost. And still, some laughed. Always a few. A merchant from Two Forks who claimed Langston was just a lucky crank. A preacher who said men weren't meant to live underground like rats. But the mountain didn't care who laughed. It froze and thawed on its own schedule. And when that schedule turned again, earlier than usual, crueler than expected, those who'd listened were ready. Langston's 3 chambers didn't just hold his wood and food that year. They held 6 neighbors, 3 children, and a pregnant woman whose cabin had buckled under snow. The firewood room became a gathering space, the stove replaced with a sunken brazier to draw out more heat. The food room fed them. The spring chamber kept them clean and hydrated. When the wind screamed outside and the snow piled 6 feet against doors, they stayed underground, not because they were hiding, because they'd built a spine, a body beneath the mountain. When spring returned, the snow peeled away from the slope like old bark. Langston emerged first, same as always, quiet, watching, listening. Boone followed, carrying the child born midwinter in his arms. Clara led the rest, guiding them out like a shepherd, eyes keen, and the world beyond had changed, not in trees or rivers, but in memory, because now the people who once mocked the idea of burying fire were building rooms of their own. Across the ridges, tiny mounds dotted the landscape, modest at first, rough, but they were learning, and Langston didn't have to lead them, just let the mountain teach them the way it taught him, one lesson at a time, by rot, by freeze, by thaw, and now, by warmth. The man who once dug in silence, mocked as mad, had become something more than a builder, not a leader, not a prophet, but a memory kept alive through dirt and hands and frostbit prayers. Langston never called it that, never spoke of legacy. He just kept digging, because some lessons had no end. They lived on, beneath the surface, where the fire stayed dry, and grief turned slowly to shelter.